By 1917, New York City progressive mayor John Mitchell had put the Gary Plan into action in 30 New York schools. But that move embroiled the school system and the city in a violent controversy. In the mayor's race of 1917, Democratic opponent John Hylan attacked the Gary Plan as a plot to turn out cheap labor for large corporations.
I say to you, Mr. Mayor, hands off our public schools. Our boys and girls shall have an opportunity to become lawyers, doctors, clergymen, musicians, poets, or men of letters, notwithstanding the views of the Board of Education.
Most of the immigrants were from Eastern Europe. Many of them were Jewish, and they wanted their children to get the best possible academic education. They didn't want their kids to be prepared to work in a factory, which is the way they perceived the Gary Plan.
John Hylan won the 1917 mayor's race by a landslide. The day after the election, he announced that the Gary Plan would be canceled. New York schools returned to a more traditional curriculum, in use since the turn of the century. Here, as in Gary, educators faced the task of socializing large numbers of immigrant children. New York published its own series of textbooks that focused on the English language, patriotism, and American citizenship.
Officially, the idea was to get us out of the barbarism of our immigrant background. But the idea was to Americanize us, as they say, and it did.
New York's English-only curriculum was radical for its day. In the years before World War I, schools in many cities had taught courses in the language of the major immigrant group.
Hundreds of thousands of children learned German or learned in German in public schools and learned about the glories of Germany.
By 1917, America was at war. Former President Theodore Roosevelt was among those leading a call for an English-only curriculum.
We have room for but one language here, and that is the English language. For we intend to see that the Crucible turns our people out as Americans, of American nationality, and not as dwellers of a polyglot boarding house.
After the Allied victory in 1918, school children destroyed all their textbooks that were written in German. 35 states required instruction in English only and history courses that celebrated American heroes. In addition to patriotic songs, students in assembly often recited passages from the Bible or the Lord's Prayer. Christian holidays were celebrated, even in cities like New York, where large numbers of students were Jewish. American secular holidays were also part of the curriculum. Since the turn of the century, new high schools had been opening at the rate of one per day. As the system expanded, so did the bureaucracy. Enter a new breed of progressive educators, steeped in the cult of efficiency. Elwood P. Cubberly had started out as a teacher in a one-room Indiana schoolhouse. He came to regard this one-size-fits-all education as woefully out of date.
We should give up the exceedingly democratic idea that all are equal, and that our society is devoid of classes.
Head of the Department of Education at Stanford University, Cubberly trained a generation of administrators in what was called the science of school management. Public high schools in the early 1900s had given all students the same classical college prep curriculum. In the 1920s, they were revamped as administrators like Cubberly introduced career tracking.
During that era, educators embraced the idea that the college-bound program was only for the very smart kids and that everybody else should be divided up and given a different kind of program depending on where they expected to be in their life. So many girls were put into a household arts curriculum. Many of the boys were put into an industrial education program because it was assumed that they would be factory workers. Many others were put into a commercial program because they would be clerks.
People began to think of going to school as a way of getting a job, not as going to school to become a wise person or being a consumer of literature. And in fact, they talked about, does a bricklayer really need to know Shakespeare? Only those who are going on to college should study Shakespeare, and for bricklayers, we'll give them a different type of English to study.
What school administrators needed was an efficient way to sort through growing numbers of students. They turned to a test designed to measure a student's intelligence quotient, or IQ. Developed in France, IQ tests were popularized by a colleague of Coverley's at Stanford, psychologist Lewis Terman.
Lewis Terman believed that the intelligence test was a technology that could transform America and help it achieve a utopia. In Terman's view, if we could use the test to assess every child in the public schools, we would have a better understanding of each individual's ability or capacity and create a kind of social efficiency for the country.
You have to understand about IQ testers. They're very idealistic. They're sort of social visionaries who want to use the school system to create a society in which people are ruled by those with high IQ scores.
During World War I, Terman and a group of psychologists had field tested their exam on 1.7 million U.S. Army recruits. Scores on word and picture problems helped to determine which men would be assigned desk jobs in Washington and which men would be sent to the trenches in France. Psychologists concluded that the average mental age of American adults was 13.7 years. They also claimed that ethnicity affected intelligence. These controversial theories would have a major impact on schools.
The test scores of different ethnic groups were ordered from Anglo-Saxon to Italian to Polish to Native American to African Americans. So there was this sense that IQ tests could be used to determine the quality of people by ethnicity, by race, by class. And so the very belief in the capacity of people to learn was undermined, particularly by psychologists like Terman.
By the 1920s, over 1 million children were being tested each year. Questions were designed to measure mental aptitude rather than academic achievement. Some were highly subjective.
True or false? We seldom desire food when we are very sad. True or false? A large man is always braver than a small one.
In the 1920s, the Los Angeles schools were using IQ tests to spot future leaders. In the 1920s, students were measured in everything from home ec skills to citizenship, in what one critic called an orgy of tabulation.
The trouble with the IQ movement, among many troubles, is there's a tendency to say, well, we can write off everybody else.
I remember being given a few tests, but I was never told, we were not told what the purpose was.
I remember just being tracked into shop courses, so I guess I didn't test very well.